The Ruby Chalice by Lyshyn. Chapter 1. A house that remembers thirst. The road into Valerius was narrow enough that the trees leaned over it like listeners. June had already thickened the air with heat, yet the forest held a damp chill that clung to the skin as if the sunlight outside were only a rumor. The car's tires whispered on gravel. No birds argued in the branches, no insects sang. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate, the kind a room takes when someone has just spoken a name. He hadn't been back since the funeral. He told himself he was returning for practical reasons, for paperwork and a sale. Grandmother's house sat on land he didn't want to keep. It made sense to come while the weather was warm. It made sense to be efficient. But the village looked unchanged in the way old photographs look unchanged. Flat, drained of motion, missing the small accidents of life. Curtains hung still in open windows. A dog lay under a fence without lifting its head. Even the smoke from a distant chimney rose straight up, unbothered by wind. At the first turn, he passed the small sun-bleached sign with the village name. The paint had cracked into thin lines like veins. Beneath it, someone had nailed a second board, fresh wood with fresh letters carved into it. Do not drink. He slowed without meaning to, staring at the warning until the shape of the letters began to feel like a mouth. Then he drove on, telling himself it was a joke. A local superstition, the kind of thing people left out to spook outsiders. A mile later, the warning still sat in his mind like a stone under the tongue. When he reached the main street, he saw a few people standing outside the shop, not talking, just watching him pass. Their faces were summer-browned, their eyes pale and flat, and their stillness made him think of animals that have learned the exact moment a trap snaps shut. He nodded once. Nobody nodded back. The village accepted his return the way a lake accepts a thrown coin, without ripples. The house waited at the end of an overgrown lane, set back from the road beneath apple trees that hadn't been pruned in years. The branches sagged heavy with green fruit, and the leaves barely moved. He noticed, as he parked, that the shade under those trees was colder than it should have been, as if the sunlight above could not fully reach the ground. Grandmother's porch steps creaked the same way they had when he was a child. The railings still wore the gouge marks from the time he'd tried to carve his initials with a pocket knife. He ran his fingers over the scars without thinking, feeling the grain of the wood, the old stubbornness of the place. The front door key turned with a reluctant clunk. The house smell hit him immediately. Dried herbs, old paper, and the faintest trace of something metallic, like pennies warmed in a fist. Dust lay in quiet sheets on the furniture. In the corner of the sitting room, the grandfather clock had stopped at 3:12 and seemed offended by the idea of moving again. He walked from room to room, checking windows, checking locks. Everything looked preserved, as if his grandmother might walk in from the garden at any moment and scold him for leaving footprints. Then he tried the basement door. It sat at the end of the kitchen hall, a narrow wooden door that had always seemed slightly too thick for the wall. As a child, he'd been told not to go down there. It wasn't fear, grandmother would say. It was respect, and she would tap her knuckle twice against the door as if greeting someone on the other side. He slid the key ring onto his finger and tested each key. None fit. He found the old brass lock on the basement door and saw fresh scratches around it, thin and pale against the dark metal. Someone had tried to force it. Recently. The marks looked too clean to be ancient wear. He leaned closer and listened. Nothing. Still, the air in the hall felt different, cooler, heavier. The house, which had been silent, now felt as if it was holding its breath in that narrow space. He backed away and told himself he'd deal with it later. He would call a locksmith. He would be sensible. But as he turned, he realized something else. There was no key for the basement on the ring at all. Grandmother had never given him one. He went into town that evening, because quiet houses make the mind invent noises. The sun sat low and hot over the village square where strings of paper flags hung limply between poles. A summer fair had sprung up as if it happened every year without being advertised beyond local habit. Wooden stalls, jars of honey, bundles of dried flowers, cheap toys, and the smell of grilled meat that should have made him hungry. But it didn't. People smiled too quickly here, the smiles slipping on and off like masks. Children ran in careful circles, staying within sight of adults, never straying into the shadows between stalls. Music played, an accordion wheezing out something old, but the tune sounded tired, as if it had been forced to repeat itself for too many summers. He walked past a stall where an old woman sold carved cups and cheap jewelry. Her hands were stained dark, and her fingernails were unusually clean. She looked up at him with eyes the color of weak tea. "You're her grandson," she said, not asking. He felt the hairs on his arms lift. Yes. Her gaze flicked to the road behind him, as if expecting someone else to arrive. "House still standing?" "Of course." "Basement still locked?" He hesitated. "Yes." The woman nodded as if that confirmed something. Then she leaned closer and her voice dropped into the low tone people use for prayers and threats. "You know the story of the cup that never empties?" He gave a polite shrug. "I've heard a lot of stories as a kid. This one isn't for children." She tapped the wooden counter twice, the same rhythm his grandmother used on the basement door. "Every summer it fills itself. Ruby red, thick, and if someone drinks, they don't die." He almost laughed. "Then what happens?" The woman's mouth tightened. "They get strong, their wounds close, their sleep becomes light, their hunger becomes particular." Her eyes didn't blink, "and the owner of the cup comes to collect." He frowned. "Owner? You don't own what drinks before you do." She nodded toward his chest as if she could hear his heartbeat. "And the cup doesn't give. It invests." A man behind him bumped his shoulder and muttered an apology that didn't sound sincere. When he turned, the man was already moving away, head lowered, as if he'd only come close enough to confirm he was real. He looked back at the old woman's stall. She was watching him like a judge watches a witness. Then she added softly, "Your grandmother was good at saying no. You should learn." The church stood at the far end of the square, whitewashed and small, its bell tower leaning slightly like an old man listening. He didn't intend to enter, but he found his feet carrying him toward it anyway, drawn by the shadowed doorway and the quiet inside. The air in the church was cooler than the evening outside. Candles burned in front of icons, their flames steady despite the open door. The smell of wax and incense should have been comforting, but it mixed with that faint metallic note he'd noticed in the house. A priest stood near the altar, tall and too thin for his black robe. He had a face that looked carved rather than grown, sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, lips that rarely softened into expression. He turned as if he'd been waiting. "You returned," the priest said. He swallowed. "I did." The priest's gaze moved over him slowly, like fingers testing fabric. "To sell the house?" "I haven't decided." The priest stepped closer, and for a moment the candlelight seemed to dim around him. "You will decide quickly," he said, voice low. "This village is not generous with time." He tried to keep it casual. "Everyone talks like there's something wrong with my grandmother's house." The priest didn't deny it. "There is something old beneath it." He wanted to ask about the cup, about the legend, but the priest raised one hand slightly, a gesture that felt like a boundary. "Do not go there at night," he said. "Basement?" The priest's eyes narrowed the smallest amount. "Anywhere the air gets colder without reason. Anywhere you smell iron without blood." He stepped closer until they were close enough for the priest's breath to touch his cheek. Cool, strangely cool. "And if you hear knocking, do not answer. Not with words, not with hands." The warning should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it landed in him with the weight of something that had been said too many times. He forced a nervous laugh. "You're making it sound like there's a monster in my basement." The priest's expression didn't change. "There is a debt," he said. "And debts don't like to be forgotten." As he turned to leave, the priest added one last line, quiet enough that it could have been meant for the walls instead of him. "Your grandmother held the door shut for a long time. You should not be the one who opens it." That night, the house did what silent houses always do. It became louder. He tried to sleep in the bedroom that had once been his grandmother's, because it felt less lonely than the guest room. The bed smelled faintly of lavender, and the curtains hung thick and heavy, blocking the moonlight. He lay awake, listening to the old house settle. Wood creaking, pipes cooling, the distant tick of the clock that had stopped years ago yet still seemed present in the air. Then the knocking began, not at the door, inside the wall. A dull, wet sound, spaced evenly, as if someone tapped from within a throat. Knock, pause, knock. He sat up slowly, heart beating hard, and stared at the wallpaper where the sound seemed strongest. The pattern of flowers on the wall looked wrong in the dimness, the petals resembling open mouths. The knocks continued, and between them he heard something else, so faint his mind tried to deny it. A gulping sound. Like swallowing? He swung his legs out of bed and crossed the room with careful steps, trying not to make noise. He pressed his ear to the wall. The wallpaper was cold under his cheek. Knock. It vibrated against his skull. He jerked back, breath sharp, and the sound stopped instantly, as if whatever had been knocking had been listening too. Silence returned, thick and expectant. He stood there in the darkness, waiting for the knocks to resume, for his rational mind to label it as pipes, as rodents, as old beams. But what returned was worse than knocking. A soft exhale. Not his own. From somewhere in the hall, morning brought sunlight that felt indecently normal. He made coffee, opened windows, told himself the night had been a trick of nerves and old house acoustics. It was almost working until he saw the kitchen floor. A dark stain sat near the basement door. It hadn't been there the day before. He was sure of it. The wooden boards were old but clean, and he remembered thinking they'd need polish before selling. Now the stain looked like something had seeped up from beneath, dark and glossy, not watery, thick. It caught the light with a dull ruby sheen. He crouched and touched it with a fingertip. It was warm. Not room temperature warm. Warmer, as if it held heat the way flesh holds heat. He brought his finger closer to his nose. The smell hit him, iron. He stood abruptly, nausea rising. He went to the sink and scrubbed his hand until the skin reddened. The stain remained on the wood as if it belonged there. He fetched a mop and cleaning solution. He scrubbed. The stain did not lift. Instead, as the sun climbed higher and the kitchen warmed, the stain seemed to spread a fraction wider, creeping along the grain like it was learning the shape of the room. By noon, he could have sworn it pulsed faintly in the heat shimmer. He stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead, and stared at the basement door. The brass lock looked unchanged, but the air around it felt colder than the rest of the kitchen. The house could be warm. The door could be cold, and the floor could bleed. He tried to leave the house that afternoon. He loaded a box of papers into his car, intending to drive back into town, sit in a cafe, remind himself the world contained ordinary sounds and ordinary people. The front door stuck as he pulled it closed, resisting for a second as if it didn't want him to go. When it finally shut, he heard a soft sound behind him. A step. He turned sharply. The kitchen was empty, but on the wooden floor leading from the hall toward the basement door were footprints. Bare footprints. They were not muddy. They were not dusty. They were damp, as if someone had stepped out of cold water and onto warm wood. The toes were long, the arches narrow. Each print was too precise, too clean. They ended directly in front of the basement door. No prints led away. His throat tightened. He took one step forward, then another, as if his body had forgotten the concept of self-preservation. The air near the door was noticeably colder. His breath fogged faintly. He reached out and touched the brass lock. It was cold enough to sting. Then, from inside the door, he heard the smallest sound. So small, it could have been his imagination. A soft, satisfied swallow. He found his neighbor in the garden next door, an old woman bent over her bean rows. Her name, he remembered suddenly, was Mrs. Dinah. As a child, he'd been afraid of her because she never smiled with her eyes. She didn't look up when he approached. "You heard it," she said. He stopped short. "Heard what?" "The house." She plucked a weed and crushed it between her fingers. The sap smelled sharp. "It talks at night." He stared at her. "There are footprints in my kitchen." Now she looked up and her eyes were pale and tired. "Then it's waking," she whispered, as if saying it louder might help it hear. He forced himself to ask, "What is it?" Mrs. Dinah glanced toward his house, then toward the tree line, then back to him. The movements felt ritual, like someone checking for witnesses. "Every summer," she said softly, "someone vanishes in Valerius. Sometimes a traveler, sometimes a drunk, sometimes a boy who thinks he's brave." Her mouth tightened. "We say they ran away, we say they drowned, we say wolves. What really happens?" She hesitated. Then she leaned closer, and her whisper smelled of soil and old fear. "The cup fills, someone drinks, the owner comes." He felt the words settle into him like cold water. "You think my grandmother, your grandmother was the last one who didn't drink," Mrs. Dinah said. "That's why she got to die in bed." He recoiled at the cruelty of that sentence. Mrs. Dinah straightened slowly, joints creaking. "Sell the house," she said, "or burn it. But don't stay when the air goes still. Still air means he's near." He swallowed. "Who?" She stared at him for a long moment, and her voice dropped into something almost reverent. "The one the cup belongs to." That evening he pried up the kitchen boards. He told himself it was logical. If the stain was coming from beneath, there might be a leak. If there were footprints, there might be moisture. He needed explanations. He worked with a crowbar and a hammer until the first board lifted with a groan. Dust puffed up, smelling of old wood and dry rot. Beneath the boards, instead of pipes or wires, he found a cavity lined with stone, an intentional space sealed like a hidden compartment. And in that compartment lay a copper seal. It was heavy in his hand, cold despite the warm kitchen. The surface was engraved with a crest he didn't recognize, a stylized chalice surrounded by thorn-like shapes, and above it, a symbol that looked like an eye crossed out. The edges of the seal were worn as if it had been handled often. There were scratches on it too, fresh ones, like fingernails. He flipped it over. Words had been carved into the copper, shallow but clear. Not a gift. A claim. His heart hammered. He looked toward the basement door, half expecting it to open. Instead, the house remained still, too still. And in that stillness, he became aware of his own breathing, loud and warm and careless. Night fell like a curtain. The air outside became heavy and windless, the kind of summer night where leaves don't move and insects stop singing as if they've been warned. He sat in the kitchen with the copper seal on the table, staring at it while the basement door stared back. Then the smell arrived. Iron. Not faint, not subtle. It rolled through the house in a slow wave, thick enough to taste on the tongue. He stood abruptly, chair scraping loud, and the smell seemed to intensify, as if reacting to movement. His throat tightened. He checked the sink. No blood. He checked the cupboards. Nothing spilled. He checked his own hands as if he might have cut himself without noticing. No, the smell wasn't coming from an injury. It was coming from the house itself, from the hallway, from the basement door. He stepped closer, every instinct screaming to stop. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of iron grew sweeter, deeper, like a promise made of metal. He raised his hand toward the lock, and the knocking returned, this time not from the wall but from behind the door. A slow, patient rhythm. Knock. Pause. Knock. Between the knocks, he heard something that made his blood run colder than the air. A soft sound, like liquid rising in a cup. And then, as if the house itself had learned how to speak, a whisper threaded through the silence, so faint it could have been the sound of his own breath turning against him. Drink. He stood frozen in the dark kitchen, hand hovering inches from the lock, and understood with sudden clarity. The house wasn't haunted. It was waiting. And it had been waiting for him. Chapter 2. The Chalice That Fills Itself. He did not sleep. Night pressed against the windows like a warm, wet cloth, sealing the house in stillness. The smell of iron lingered, not as a passing scent, but as a presence, an invisible occupant that had chosen the kitchen as its room. He sat at the table with the copper seal in his palm until his fingers went numb from gripping it. The basement door waited at the end of the hall. Every few minutes, he convinced himself he'd imagined the whisper. Every few minutes he heard it again, not as a voice but as an intention threaded through the silence. Drink. At last he stood, because sitting had become another kind of surrender. He approached the door the way a careful person approaches a sleeping animal, slow, eyes on every detail. The brass lock was unchanged. His key ring was useless. The air around the door still held that unnatural cold. A pocket of winter trapped behind old wood. His hand hovered over the lock, then withdrew. The priest's warning echoed, "Don't go there at night." Yet something in him, some stubborn part that hated being manipulated by a house, refused to retreat. He did not use force. He did not strike the lock. Instead, he did the strangest thing, the most humiliating thing for a rational mind. He spoke to it. Not loudly, not bravely, softly, as if the door might startle. "I'm not here to," he began. The hallway swallowed the words. He tried again. "I'm not here to drink." The cold deepened as if the house had leaned closer. His mouth went dry. He looked at the copper seal on the table behind him, the crest, the crossed-out eye, the words carved into it, "Not a gift." A claim throbbed behind his eyes. A word. The basement opens not with a key, but with a word. He didn't know the word. He didn't know if there even was one. But he remembered his grandmother's habit. 2 taps against the basement door, like greeting someone. He stepped closer and tapped twice with his knuckles. The sound was dull, swallowed instantly. Then he whispered, almost without choosing it, "No." The brass lock clicked, not from turning, from inside. The door creaked open a finger's width, exhaling cold air that smelled like stone and iron and something sweeter, like old wine left too long in a cup. Horror didn't come as a scream. It came as a quiet thought. The house had been listening for that word, and it had understood it. The darkness beyond the door was not the friendly dark of a closet or a cellar. It felt thick, structured, like a room filled with velvet curtains. His flashlight beam slid into it and seemed to weaken, as if the air itself drank light. Stone steps descended immediately, older than the house above. He had assumed the basement was beneath the kitchen, like any normal basement. But these steps were carved, worn at the edges and damp with a cold that seeped into his soles. He descended carefully, one hand on the wall. The walls were not wood. They were stone, slick and slightly uneven, as if the staircase had been cut into something older than the village. His breath fogged and then thinned, the air too cold to hold moisture. And it wasn't simply cold. It was selectively cold, the way a hand is cold when it has been holding metal in winter. The air felt like it had memory, like it had been chilled not by weather, but by long proximity to something that did not want warmth to enter. Halfway down, his flashlight flickered. Not from failing batteries. The beam simply stuttered as if something had passed through it. He froze, listening. There was no wind, no dripping water, no rats. Yet he could sense space opening around him, a widening that didn't fit the narrow hall above. It felt like walking into a throat. At the bottom of the steps, the corridor widened into a small chamber with a low ceiling. The stone was polished in places, almost smooth, not by tools but by repeated contact. Hands, shoulders, bodies moving through it over years. His stomach tightened. People had been down here, not to store potatoes, to do something else. To do something that required the dark to stay close. The niche was set into the far wall like a shrine. He didn't notice it immediately, because the chamber seemed built to guide the eye downward, toward the floor, toward the darkness pooled in the corners. But when his flashlight beam lifted, it caught the object and returned a glint so sharp it felt like a needle in the eyes. A chalice. Not wood, not clay. Metal. Darkened, almost black, as if it had been smoked over fire or buried for centuries. Its surface wasn't smooth. It carried etchings that looked like vines or thorns wrapped around the bowl. And inside it was a sheen of ruby. Not a reflection, a liquid. It sat low at first, a dark pool at the bottom, but as he watched he realized it wasn't still. It trembled slightly, as if responding to his presence. His throat tightened. His mind tried to shove the scene into a safe category. A prank. A hidden cup left by teenagers. Some old family heirloom forgotten. But the niche itself contradicted that. The stone around the chalice was worn smooth by countless touches. The floor beneath it carried faint scratches, like something heavy had been dragged into position many times. He stepped closer. The ruby liquid caught the flashlight beam and held it, glowing dull red like embers buried in ash. A familiar smell rose. Iron, yes, but also something else, rich and heavy, like fermenting fruit. His mouth watered involuntarily. He hated that. He hated the way his body reacted, as if the chalice were food. He lifted the chalice with careful hands. The metal was colder than the stone steps, a cold so deep it seemed to come from within the object itself. It weighed more than it should have. Not just heavy, anchored as if gravity took it personally. He turned it to catch the flashlight beam along its rim. Letters were carved there, fine and shallow. They curved in a script he didn't recognize, too elegant to be modern, too deliberate to be random. He traced them with his thumb, feeling the grooves. As he did, the letters seemed to darken, filling with shadow, becoming clearer only under artificial light. He remembered the old woman's words, letters on the metal that refused to be read in daylight. His stomach tightened. He couldn't explain why it mattered, but it did. The chalice was not meant to be interpreted under the sun. It belonged to night. He carried it up the steps, intending, foolishly, to bring it into the kitchen and examine it properly. He wanted daylight. He wanted distance from the cold. But the moment he crossed the threshold at the top of the stairs, the letters faded. Under the warmer air, they became vague scratches again, as if the chalice had retracted its meaning. He tried standing near the window where moonlight fell. Nothing. He tried a desk lamp. The letters returned faintly, like ink waking on paper. It wasn't that he couldn't read them. It was that the chalice decided when it could be read. He set it on the kitchen table and stared until his eyes burned. The words remained frustratingly incomplete, but one thing became clear. The inscription was not decoration. It was a contract. He should have left it alone. He should have taken it out of the house, thrown it into the river, buried it under a road. He should have called the priest and demanded explanations. Instead, he watched it. Minutes passed. The house remained windless and quiet. The chalice sat on the table like a patient animal. Then the liquid rose, not splashing, not boiling. Rising. The surface lifted in a smooth swell, as if something beneath were inflating it. The ruby sheen climbed the inner bowl without leaving a mark, and the level increased by a visible fraction. He leaned closer, breath shallow. The liquid wasn't pouring in from anywhere. There were no hidden tubes, no trick. It rose the way a lung rises with breath. Inhale. The ruby climbed. Exhale. It settled, only slightly lower, then climbed again. He stared until his eyes blurred, trying to catch the mechanism, trying to see if the liquid was being drawn up from the metal itself. Then the smell intensified, filling the kitchen, thick and sweet and metallic. He felt a dull ache behind his teeth, the way hunger feels when it's been ignored too long. He swallowed, and his throat clicked loudly in the silence. The ruby liquid paused, as if listening, and then rose again, faster. A thought slid into him with chilling ease. It knows you're watching. And a second thought followed, quieter but sharper. It knows you're thirsty. He didn't decide to touch it. His hand moved the way hands sometimes move in dreams, detached from reason, guided by a quiet certainty that resistance is useless. He reached out and dipped a fingertip into the ruby surface. The liquid was thicker than water, warmer than expected, and it clung to his skin with a slow reluctance. He pulled his finger back. A single drop remained on the tip, heavy, gleaming dark red in the lamplight. His body reacted instantly. A low, involuntary tightening in his throat, a faint, dizzy warmth behind his eyes. The sudden, vivid memory of biting his lip as a child and tasting the smallest smear of blood, sharp, metallic, strangely satisfying. He stared at the drop, fascinated and repulsed. Then he realized something that made his stomach twist. His fingertip tingled. Not burning, not itching, yearning. As if his skin itself recognized the substance. As if some ancient part of the body remembered a taste and demanded it back. His mouth watered again. He clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He forced himself to wipe the drop on a paper towel. The paper towel darkened, then, impossibly, the stain seemed to fade. Not drying but vanishing, as if the liquid refused to remain anywhere but the chalice. He stared at his clean fingertip. heart racing. The taste remained in his mind without ever touching his tongue, a taste memory without tasting. He backed away from the table. The chalice sat perfectly still, its surface smooth again, innocent as a polished jewel. But the air around it felt eager. He fetched a glass bowl from the cupboard and placed it beside the chalice. He told himself he would be scientific, controlled. He would remove the liquid and see what it was. Maybe it wasn't blood. Maybe it was something like wine mixed with iron-rich soil. Maybe there was a perfectly boring explanation. He lifted the chalice carefully and tilted it over the bowl. The ruby liquid poured out in a slow ribbon. It looked too beautiful, thick and glossy, catching lamplight like dark gemstones melting. It hit the glass bowl with a soft sound that made his stomach flip. For 1 second he felt relief. Then the liquid moved. Not spreading like a normal fluid, not settling. It drew itself together in the bowl as if gathering courage. Then, against gravity, it began to climb. He froze. The ribbon of liquid rose up the inside of the bowl, sliding toward the lip with deliberate, slow motion. It reached the edge, paused, and then poured itself back into the chalice as if returning home. Not splashing. Not spilling. Like a creature finding its nest. The last drop clung to the glass for a moment, trembling, then detached and snapped back into the chalice in a smooth arc. He lowered the chalice with shaking hands. The bowl was empty, not stained, not even damp. The chalice's level was exactly what it had been before he poured. He backed away, breath ragged, and whispered something that wasn't a prayer but sounded like one. No. The kitchen light flickered, and from the hallway, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of something swallowing. He found the journal in the only place he hadn't searched, inside the grandfather clock. The clock had been silent since his grandmother's death, its face frozen at 3:12. He had assumed it was broken, a piece of furniture now. But when he leaned close, he noticed a faint seam along the side panel, too clean to be part of the original woodwork. He pressed. The panel shifted. A hidden compartment opened, releasing a breath of stale air and dried lavender. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. His hands trembled as he untied it. The journal pages were thin, crowded with tight handwriting. The ink had browned with age. The first entry was dated more than 100 years ago. He read by lamplight, eyes burning, heart pounding. "If you find this, you are already being watched," the first line began. The journal belonged to his great-grandfather, someone he knew only as a name on a family tree. The man wrote not like a superstitious villager, but like someone trying to convince himself he wasn't insane. He described the chalice. He described the ruby liquid. He described summer nights that went windless and thick. And over, in different words, he wrote the same warning: do not drink. The chalice does not belong to us. It belongs to its owner, and the owner arrives when invited. There were sketches, too, of the copper seal, of the crest, of the crossed-out eye symbol. The same phrase appeared in the margin of multiple pages, written as if by a shaking hand. He does not need a door. He needs consent. He swallowed hard, nausea rising. Consent. Invitation. A word. The basement opened not with a key, but with a word. He looked toward the chalice on the table. Its ruby surface gleamed faintly, as if pleased to be remembered. Sleep, when it finally took him, was not rest. He dreamed he was standing in the hallway facing the basement door. The house was silent except for a sound like slow breathing, inhale, exhale, from behind the wood. The door moved with the breath, swelling subtly as if it were made of skin instead of timber. He tried to step back, but the floorboards held his feet like glue. The copper seal lay on the floor in front of him, and the chalice sat on top of it as if placed on an altar. The ruby liquid rose to the brim. In the dream, he didn't drink. The liquid rose anyway. It spilled over the rim, not in a rush but in a slow crawl, like syrup. It flowed across the floor, forming a path toward him. He tried to scream, but his mouth was full of iron. The ruby reached his boots and climbed them like climbing vines. He felt it wrap his ankles, warm and intimate, and his heart began to beat slower, as if the liquid had found the rhythm and decided to change it. Then he heard footsteps, not his own. footsteps moving across the hall behind him, close enough to feel the floor vibrate. He turned. A figure stood there in the dimness, taller than the ceiling should allow. It wore a dark coat that seemed woven from shadow. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes were clear, blank, reflective, less like the pupil of deep water. He tried to look at its feet. There was no shadow beneath it. And as it leaned closer, he understood with dream clarity that the figure was not entering the house. It was arriving in the way a memory arrives, suddenly, completely, without crossing distance. It whispered his name with a familiarity that made his skin crawl. Then he woke with his throat raw, as if he'd been swallowing for hours. The house was quiet, but the air was windless, and the kitchen smelled faintly of iron. He sat at the window until the deepest part of night. The village lay under moonlight that didn't move. Trees stood still. Curtains in neighboring houses hung like dead flags. Even the dog that usually barked at night was silent. At first he heard nothing. Then, faintly from down the road, a sound like distant tapping. It repeated at a steady pace, tap, tap, tap. His pulse quickened. The sound grew louder. Not a car, not footsteps. Not bicycles. Hooves. Horse hooves on hard road, approaching slowly, as if the rider had all the time in the world. He held his breath and watched the empty street. The hooves came closer, crisp and unmistakable, the rhythm perfectly measured. He expected to see a horse emerge from the darkness, to see breath in the cold air, to hear harness leather creak, but the street remained empty. No movement, no silhouette, only the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped directly in front of his house. Silence returned, thick enough to press against the glass. He stared at the porch, waiting for footsteps on the steps, for a knock, for anything that would confirm reality. Nothing. Then, very softly, he heard the front gate latch click, as if opened by an unseen hand. The kitchen light flickered once, and from the table behind him, the chalice made the faintest sound. Not a clink, not a splash, a single slow ripple across its ruby surface, like something inside had smiled. In the hall, the basement door creaked, not opening, not closing, just shifting with a breath that did not belong to the house. And in the air, close enough to feel against his ear, a whisper arrived with the certainty of an old debt being collected. "You said no," it murmured, amused and patient. "But you came down anyway." Chapter 3. Strength that arrives with a price. Morning came again, but it did not feel like morning inside the house. The sunlight through the curtains was pale, diluted, as if the air itself had learned to filter warmth. He tried to move through routine, coffee, dishes, papers, because routine is a kind of spell people cast to keep fear from crossing the threshold. It didn't work. His hand shook slightly as he reread his great-grandfather's words. He does not need a door. He needs consent. He told himself he had not consented. He told himself he had only looked, only touched, only listened. His thoughts were interrupted by a mundane accident, his finger slipping against the edge of a kitchen knife while he cut bread. It wasn't a deep cut, barely a line, enough to sting. But the blood that followed was wrong. It didn't bead and stop the way it should. It gathered slowly, thickly, as if taking its time. Then it slid down his fingertip in a smooth, deliberate drop that felt almost obedient, as if his body had been waiting for permission to spill. He blinked, startled. He pressed a cloth to it. The cloth came away red, and the smell of iron rose instantly, stronger than the wound deserved. He stood frozen, cloth in hand, because the house reacted. Not with a sound, with a pause. The air in the kitchen seemed to hush, the way a room hushes when someone opens a valuable bottle. He glanced toward the table. The chalice sat where he had left it, dark metal drinking lamplight even in day. Its ruby surface trembled faintly. He felt something in his chest tighten, not pain, not fear. More like recognition. His cut stopped bleeding suddenly, too suddenly. The line on his finger closed as if stitched from within. He stared at his skin, breath shallow, and understood a terrible thing. The house had noticed his blood. And the chalice had approved. That day he didn't tire. He should have. He had slept poorly for nights. His nerves were stretched. His mind had been chewing the same terror until it tasted like metal. Yet his body moved with a calm steadiness that felt borrowed. He carried boxes from room to room, climbed the attic ladder twice, scrubbed the kitchen floor again, even though the stain refused to leave. Hours passed. His muscles did not ache. His eyes did not droop. Even his hunger was muted, as if his body had forgotten to demand. He paused by the sink, placed 2 fingers against his throat, and felt his pulse. It was steady. Too steady. Not the slightly uneven rhythm of a living person who has climbed stairs and worried and bled. It was a clean metronome, patient and controlled, like something keeping time for a ritual. He tried to force it faster, did jumping jacks in the hallway like a man trying to laugh off madness. His heart sped up, yes, but it returned to perfect steadiness the moment he stopped, as if corrected by an unseen hand. That night, lying in bed, he became aware that he was not breathing deeply. He didn't need to. He could lie still for long minutes without inhaling, and panic did not come. The body can do many strange things under stress, he told himself. Adrenaline, shock, the mind making the body feel invincible. But then another thought, colder, arrived. Maybe it isn't adrenaline, maybe it's an installment. On the 3rd evening, he went to the bathroom and washed his face until his skin was cold. He looked up. The mirror returned his reflection as always. Same hair, same tired lines, same mouth set in a stubborn shape. Yet something in the eyes was different. Not the color. The attention behind them. He leaned closer. His reflection leaned closer too, but the movement felt out of sync, not in timing, but in intention. It was as if the mirror held someone who wore his face but observed him from a calmer distance. His own gaze, he realized, had become too still. The tiny, restless flickers of worry that normally dance in a person's pupils were gone. His eyes looked settled, comfortable in shadows, like a cat's eyes at night, unbothered by darkness. He blinked. His reflection blinked. Then his reflection's mouth twitched into the faintest suggestion of a smile, so small it could have been imagined. He did not feel himself smiling. He stepped back sharply, almost stumbling. The smile vanished. The mirror returned to normal. But the chill remained, crawling under his collar like a patient finger. He didn't turn away immediately. He couldn't. Something in him needed to confirm he was still himself. In the glass, his reflection stared back without blinking for too long, and in that too long stare he saw a thought behind his eyes that belonged to him. You look better this way. He went into town because staying in the house felt like listening to a predator breathe in a closet. He told himself the village would ground him, give him ordinary conversation, ordinary sunlight. The village did neither. People looked at him differently now. Not everyone, some avoided him entirely, crossing the road when he approached, lowering their eyes as if he carried a contagious sickness. But others did the opposite. A young woman at the shop leaned too close when she handed him his change, her gaze drifting to his throat as if listening to the pulse beneath his skin. Her pupils were wide. She smiled without showing teeth. "You're staying at the old place," she said softly. He nodded, uncomfortable. "Just for a few days." Her voice dropped, intimate. "It suits you." He stepped back, disturbed by the warmth in her tone. Outside, an old man spat into the dust as he passed and muttered a word that sounded like a curse. A mother pulled her child behind her, gripping the small wrist too tight. He became aware of a pattern. Those who feared him looked like people who knew the rules. Those who leaned closer looked like people who had already broken them. He felt watched in the square, not by eyes alone, but by something heavier. Like the village itself was weighing his presence and deciding where he belonged. At the edge of the market, he saw the strange priest again, standing in the shade of the church. The priest did not wave. He did not call out. He only watched him with a look that contained no surprise at all, as if this stage had been expected, as if the village had seen this transformation before. That night, he tried to eat. He cooked eggs, bread, soup. Simple things, grounding things. He sat at the table under the kitchen light and forced himself to take bites. It was like eating paper. Texture without flavor. Warmth without comfort. He added salt. He added herbs. Nothing returned. Then he tasted something, faint at first, then stronger as he kept chewing. Metal. Not from the spoon, not from a cut in his mouth. From the food itself, as if every ingredient had been dipped in iron. He set the spoon down, stomach turning. His tongue felt wrong in his mouth. Too sensitive, too awake. He drank water. It tasted like the inside of a coin. He drank tea. It tasted like rust and sugar. He realized with quiet horror that his body was beginning to measure the world in a new way. Not by sweetness, not by bitterness, by mineral, by salt, by blood memory. He stood and opened the refrigerator, searching for something that might taste normal. His gaze landed unexpectedly on his own hand, on the faint line where the cut had been. He remembered the smell when it bled. His mouth watered. He slammed the refrigerator door shut with enough force to make the cups rattle. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to listen. It began just after midnight. A faint sound from the kitchen. Not footsteps, not a door. A liquid sound, slow and careful, like someone pouring wine into a glass in a room where noise is forbidden. He lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening. The sound repeated, a gentle glug, then a pause, then another glug. He forced himself to stay still, because movement felt like consent now. He told himself it could be plumbing. Old pipes, water settling. But the sound was too intimate to be pipes. It carried intention. He rose anyway, pulling on a shirt, moving barefoot across the hallway boards. The house felt colder than it had an hour before, as if night deepened it from within. In the doorway of the kitchen, he stopped. The chalice was on the table, and the ruby liquid inside it was moving. Not rippling randomly, but lifting and settling in a rhythm, as if an invisible hand was tilting the vessel and pouring, 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 but never letting a drop spill. The sound came again. Glug, like a careful servant filling a master's cup. Then the liquid surface stilled, and the air changed, thickening. He felt, rather than heard, that someone else was in the room. Not visible. Not yet. But present, the way a shadow is present when something solid blocks the sun. His throat tightened as he whispered, "Who's there?" The chalice answered with silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, perhaps the basement, perhaps inside the walls, came a sound like a swallow. Satisfied. By the next day, the stain near the basement door had grown. Not by much. The difference was small enough that he could have convinced himself it was imagination, if not for the shape. It wasn't spreading in a simple circle, it was forming edges. It had crept along the floorboard seams as if following ropes, like a mind tracing corridors. One thin tendril reached toward the table leg where the chalice sat, stopping just short of it like a respectful bow. He knelt and stared. In the heat of afternoon, the stain glistened faintly. Not wet exactly, alive in the way oil can look alive when light moves over it. He dragged a piece of chalk along the stain's border to mark its current size. An hour later, the chalk line was inside the stain. He stepped back, heart pounding. The stain didn't just spread, it advanced, like a shadow with purpose, like something mapping the room from below. That evening, he placed a fan in the kitchen, hoping moving air would break the oppressive stillness. The fan whirred, pushing warm air across the floor. The stain did not move. It only seemed to darken, absorbing the fan's effort without resistance, as if warmth made it comfortable, as if warmth fed it. Just after dusk, he heard the dog. Not the shopkeeper's dog, not a distant bark, but Mrs. Dinah's dog next door, the one that had always been loud, aggressive, territorial. It began howling, not barking, howling, long and frantic, the kind of sound animals make when they see something they cannot fight and cannot name. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard. The dog was visible through the fence slats, thrown back on its haunches, head lifted toward his house. Its fur stood on end. Its eyes were wide and white. It howled again, louder, as if trying to warn the whole village. Then it abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like a hand closing over his mouth. He waited for a bark, a whine, any sign of movement. Nothing. He called out, tentative. "Hey!" No answer from the dog, no footsteps from Mrs. Dana. The night had swallowed the sound as if it had been eaten. He stood on the porch, skin prickling, and realized the air had gone windless again. Still air. The village's warning. He retreated inside and locked the door, and the lock clicked too softly, as if it did not want to draw attention. He found the attic entrance because he was looking for anything that proved the house was only a house. The attic ladder creaked as he pulled it down. Dust drifted in the shaft of light. The air above smelled dry and old, the smell of forgotten fabric. He climbed carefully, flashlight in hand. The attic was cramped beneath sloping beams. Boxes sat in uneven stacks. Old clothes hung in garment bags like bodies suspended in plastic. Cobwebs glistened at the corners. Then his flashlight caught a shape draped over a trunk. A cloak. Not a modern coat. Not a raincoat. A heavy garment made of dark fabric that absorbed light. Its edges were frayed, but the cloth itself felt strangely intact, as if age had avoided it. He lifted it by the collar. Dust puffed up. The smell underneath was faintly sweet and metallic. The buttons were bone. Small, pale buttons carved smooth, each one etched with the same crest as the copper seal, the chalice surrounded by thorns. His fingers trembled as he counted them. There were 9 buttons and an empty 10th loop, as if one button, one seal, was missing. He lowered the cloak slowly, feeling as though he had touched something that should have remained asleep. Then he noticed something worse. The cloak wasn't folded like stored clothing. It looked placed, as if someone expected it to be worn again. That night the chalice spoke, not with a voice like a person's voice, with a sound that used the air as a mouth. He sat at the table with the journal open, the copper seal beside it, the cloak folded on a chair like an accusation. The ruby liquid in the chalice was high now, almost to the rim. He tried not to look at it, but the chalice had become the center of the house's gravity. Everything in the room seemed oriented toward it. He read another line from the journal. The owner arrives when invited. He whispered to himself, I didn't invite anyone. The liquid rippled. A chill ran up his spine. Then, from the chalice, came a whisper, not the blunt command of before, not simply drink, but something shaped, deliberate. A name. It slid out like velvet dragged over stone. Valerius. The word landed in the kitchen and made the air heavier. The candle flame near the sink wavered, though there was no draft. The ruby surface trembled as if pleased to be recognized. He stared at the chalice, pulse suddenly too steady again, and understood with cold certainty. The owner was no longer a legend in the village. He was becoming present in the house, present enough to speak his own name. And as the name hung in the air, the basement door in the hallway creaked, not opening, not closing, breathing in a slow, satisfied rhythm, as if something beneath the house had heard itself called and was answering, Yes, I am coming. Chapter 4. The owner of the chalice and the windless summer night. The next day the heat did not rise the way heat normally rises. It arrived already complete, as if the village had been placed beneath glass and left too close to a flame. By mid-morning the air in Valerius held a thickness that made breathing feel like drinking warm water. The sky was a hard, unbroken blue without cloud or movement. Even the shadows looked exhausted, pressed flat beneath objects rather than stretching. He stepped outside and immediately tasted metal on his tongue. The apple trees in the lane hung heavy, leaves dull and motionless. A fly landed on the porch rail and did not move again, as if the heat had stolen its decision-making. Somewhere down the road, a dog should have barked. It didn't. The village carried a silence that felt less like peace and more like reverence. People moved as if they were conserving breath. Doors remained closed. Windows were shut despite the heat, curtains pulled tight. It was as if everyone knew that opening the house to the air would invite something else in. He walked toward the square and saw something that made him stop. The fountain in the center, an old stone basin that should have been filled with water, was dry. Not recently drained. Dry in a way that looked thirsty. The stone cracked and whitened like bone. A child stood near it, staring into the empty basin as if listening. His mother yanked him away with unnecessary force and whispered something harsh. The heat did not feel like summer anymore. It felt like an oven being preheated. And in that heat, his body felt, well, he should have been sweating. He should have been miserable. Instead, he felt alert, steady, strong in a way that carried no joy. His heart beat its perfect rhythm. His skin felt too cool, as if the heat could not fully claim him. The thought came uninvited, soft and intimate. The village is being prepared. Prepared for what? He didn't want to answer. He stayed awake until evening because sleep had become a door and he no longer trusted doors. When dusk finally came, it brought no breeze, only a dimming of light like a theater curtain falling. The village did not become cooler. It became more sealed. The sky darkened, but the heat clung, and the silence deepened until he could hear his own blood moving when he swallowed. He stepped outside and walked toward the main road with his flashlight. The gravel felt warm underfoot. At the edge of the lane where the road met the village, he saw them. Hoof prints. Perfect impressions in the dust and gravel, as if a horse had walked through recently. They were not scattered. They formed a measured line, evenly spaced, heading toward his house. He crouched and examined them. The edges were crisp. No wind had softened them. The dust around each impression looked undisturbed, as if the prints had been pressed into place without the movement of an animal. A strange detail caught his eye. There were no drag marks, no scuffs, just the clean stamp of hooves. Like a creature that did not need to shift weight, like something that touched the world only when it chose. He followed the prints with his flashlight beam. They led past the square, past closed houses, past windows with no faces behind them. The village watched without watching. No one stepped outside to question him. No one called his name. He reached the point where the hoofprints turned down his lane and headed into the apple tree shade. As the light dimmed further, he realized something else. The hoofprints had not been visible earlier that day. The road had been clean. They had appeared with night. He stood, slowly, and felt the skin on his arms tighten. It wasn't a horse arriving. It was an announcement. He went to the church the next morning, driven by a desperate need for something solid. Someone who spoke in warnings and rules. The priest had looked like a man who understood the machinery beneath the village's calm. Hail, no, not Hail, he corrected himself in his own mind, clinging to his own name, had to stop thinking in the voice of other stories. He had to anchor himself. The church door was open. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Candles had burned down to stubs. The icons looked dimmer than before, their painted eyes too aware. He called out once, no answer. He walked toward the altar and noticed the priest's robe folded neatly on the back of a chair, as if removed in a hurry and then arranged by someone who cared about appearances. The priest's shoes sat beneath it, placed side by side. A strange chill crawled up his spine. He stepped behind the altar. There on a small table lay a key. Not his basement key. A different one, old iron, long-shafted, heavy. Beside it lay a note written in careful, cramped handwriting. If you must descend, do it before the door learns your name. He stared at the words until they blurred. The priest had vanished, leaving behind his robe like a shed skin. He picked up the key. It was cold enough to sting even in the church's coolness. The iron tasted like pennies when he brought it close without thinking. Outside, the village square was empty again. No voices, no laughter, no wind. He slipped the key into his pocket and felt it like a weight, as if he had accepted a role rather than found a tool. He climbed the bell tower because the note had told him to descend, and because climbing felt like the opposite of surrender. The wooden stairs spiraled upward, groaning under his weight. Dust fell in lazy drifts. The air grew thinner, hotter. At the top, the bell hung from a beam like a lung made of metal. A chain ran down from it, rusted and stiff. He touched the links and felt them crumble slightly under his fingers, leaving orange powder on his skin. Then he saw the stains. They were on the floorboards near the chain, dark blotches, sticky-looking even when dry. They had soaked into the wood so deeply the grain itself had darkened. He knelt, heart pounding, and scraped at one spot with his fingernail. The stain did not lift. The wood beneath was permanently changed, like flesh scarred. He pulled a cloth from his pocket, dampened it with water from his bottle, and rubbed. The cloth came away dark, not brown like rust, red-black. The smell rose immediately, iron, thick and sweet. He stopped rubbing, nausea tightening his throat, and looked up at the bell itself. For the first time he noticed the shallow scratches on the bell's surface, lines like handwriting carved by someone too frantic to be neat. He ran his flashlight along them and caught fragments. Do not answer. Do not drink. It hears. It comes. His stomach dropped. This tower hadn't been a place for prayer. It had been a warning station. And those stains near the chain told him what happened to people who rang the bell too late, or rang it for the wrong reason. He stepped back from the chain, wiping his hands on his jeans as if the rust could become infection. The bell remained silent. But he felt, suddenly, that the village had listened to his footsteps in the tower. That something in the heat below had turned its attention upward. By afternoon, the chalice had become impatient. He returned to the house and found the ruby liquid nearly at the brim. It had not been that full when he left in the morning. The surface was glossy, unbroken, reflecting the kitchen light like a polished gem. He set the journal beside it and watched. A ripple passed across the liquid, slow, deliberate, as if the chalice were breathing again. The level rose a fraction, then another, until a thin dome formed above the rim, held by surface tension that should not have been possible for something that thick. The smell in the room intensified. Iron and sweetness and something floral beneath, like crushed roses left in a metal cup. His mouth watered so suddenly it hurt. He backed away, pressing his tongue hard against the roof of his mouth, trying to deny the physical pull. He wanted to shout, wanted to smash the table, wanted to drag the chalice outside and throw it into sunlight. But the journal's warning echoed. He does not need a door. He needs consent. And his body's new steadiness, his lack of exhaustion, the closed cut on his finger, those were already proof that something had been accepted. He realized with a sinking dread that the chalice wasn't just filling, it was counting down. As if it measured time in the volume of ruby liquid, each rising fraction closer to a threshold. When it reaches the brim, he thought, something happens, something arrives. The house felt smaller around him, the air too thick to move. And the chalice sat at the center of it all, like an eye that never blinked. That evening, as the sun lowered, he caught movement in the kitchen window. A silhouette, tall, still, standing in the yard beneath the apple trees, just outside the last reach of light. His breath caught. He moved closer to the glass, heart still too steady, as if his body refused to react properly. The silhouette did not move. It didn't sway with breathing. It didn't shift weight. It simply stood, a shape cut from darkness. He stared harder, trying to see details, hat, coat, face, but the figure remained featureless, as if the twilight refused to reveal it. Then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The window pane reflected the kitchen behind him. Table, chair, chalice, his own pale face. But it did not reflect the figure outside. Where the silhouette stood, there was only the dark of the yard. No shape in the glass, no distortion, just absence, as if the thing outside had no relationship with light. He raised his hand slowly, almost unconsciously, and pressed his palm to the glass. The glass was cold, so cold it burned. The silhouette tilted its head a fraction, like an animal listening. He jerked his hand away. The figure remained, watching without eyes, present without reflection. His throat tightened as he whispered, Valerius. At the sound of the name, the chalice behind him made the softest ripple. The silhouette did not react, but the air in the room thickened, as if the house itself had leaned toward the window to listen. He tried to leave, not dramatically, not with bags packed, just to step outside, walk into the lane, breathe air that wasn't trapped in old walls. He reached for the front door handle. The metal was ice cold, as if the door led not to summer, but to deep winter. His fingers recoiled involuntarily. The cold felt wrong, too sharp, too immediate. It wasn't the cold of night air, it was the cold of something that wanted to keep warmth inside. He tried again, gripping harder. Pain shot through his palm. Behind him, in the hallway, a door shut. Not slammed. Closed with careful finality. He turned and saw the bedroom door now closed, though he had left it open. Then the bathroom door clicked shut. One by one, the house began to close itself, each latch clicking softly, like a mouth sealing. His breath came faster, and he hated that he could hear it. He hated that sound mattered now. He ran to the kitchen and looked at the basement door. It was closed, but the seam around it looked darker than before, as if the darkness behind it pressed outward. He stepped toward it and felt the temperature drop with each step. The ruby stain on the floor had spread further, almost touching the basement doorframe now, like a shadow crawling toward its source. The house wasn't just closing doors, it was organizing itself, preparing rooms, sealing exits. His mind offered a grim possibility. It wasn't trapping him from leaving, it was keeping something else from entering. Until the right moment. The letter arrived without sound. He found it on the kitchen table, where he had not placed it. An envelope of thick, pale paper lay beside the chalice, its surface marked with the same crest as the copper seal. Chalice, thorns, crossed out eye, pressed into the wax so deeply it looked like a wound in the paper. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The wax was warm. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, each letter shaped with patient confidence. He read it once, then again, because his mind rejected it as impossible. "You drank, so you invited me." He swallowed hard. He had not drunk, not from the chalice, not truly. But he remembered the fingertip, the tingling, the mouth watering, the taste that wasn't a taste, the cut that healed too quickly. The letter continued. "The chalice does not measure intention. It measures contact, it measures longing, it measures the moment you became mine without saying yes." His throat tightened. The words felt like cold fingers on the inside of his ribs. At the bottom, one final line. "Tonight, the wind will not blow. Do not light candles. Do not call for help. Open the door when you hear the hooves." There was no signature. It didn't need one. The name had already been spoken in the house, Valerius. He dropped the letter as if it burned. It fluttered to the table, landing inches from the chalice's rim. The ruby liquid rippled as if amused. The night arrived without transition. One moment, the sky held a bruised purple. The next, it was black, and the village was silent, as if every living thing had been told to stop. He sat in the kitchen with all lights off, except a single lamp, because darkness had become a language and he didn't want to speak it fluently. The chalice sat in the dimness, a darker shape within the dark. He tried to keep his breathing slow. He tried to keep his mind sharper than his fear. Then the footsteps began, above him, on the roof. Not the scuttle of an animal. Not the clumsy shuffle of branches, footsteps with weight and patience. Step, pause, step. They moved across the roofline slowly, as if someone were walking the perimeter, testing the house like a cage. The footsteps stopped above the kitchen. A faint creak answered, the roof beam flexing under pressure. He stared at the ceiling, throat tight. He imagined claws. He imagined hooves. He imagined a man crouched above him with a smile he could not see. The footsteps resumed, circling again. Step, pause, step. It felt like the pacing of a predator that enjoys the knowledge of trapped prey. Not rushed, not hungry in a hurry, certain. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly above the hallway. Then he heard a softer sound through the ceiling, like fabric brushing wood. A cloak dragging lightly. He felt cold sweat on his spine despite the heat in the house. The wind outside remained absent. The air was still enough that the silence had edges, and in that silence, the chalice made a tiny sound, almost affectionate. A single bubble rising and popping at the surface. The hooves came at midnight. Tap, tap, tap. They approached from down the road with the same measured rhythm he had heard before. The sound grew louder until it felt embedded in his ribs, matching the too perfect rhythm of his heart. He stood in the hallway without choosing to. The front door waited. The handle glimmered faintly in moonlight, ice cold even from a distance. Tap, tap, tap. The hooves stopped on the porch. Silence. Then the softest sound, leather creaking, as if a rider shifted weight. He could not see through the peephole. His grandmother's door didn't have one. He pressed his ear to the wood. He heard nothing but his own breath. And then a voice, quiet, intimate, came through the door as if the wood were thin as paper. "You have my cup." His skin prickled. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried authority the way winter carries authority. Unquestioned, absolute. He backed away a step, trembling, and his heel bumped the hallway wall. The voice continued, amused. "You do not have to fear me. You already belong to the bargain." He swallowed, throat tight. "I didn't agree to anything." A soft laugh, almost kind. "You did what all living things do," the voice whispered. "You reached for strength when you felt small." The front door handle turned by itself. Not violently. Gently, as if someone outside tested whether it was locked. The latch held. For a moment. Then, without the sound of a key, there was a click from within the lock. The door opened a few inches. Cold air spilled in, carrying the smell of iron and roses. He saw him then. A rider standing on the porch, cloaked in a dark mantle that drank moonlight. He was tall, posture perfectly still, as if made for portraits. His face was pale, but not corpse pale, more like marble warmed by candlelight. His eyes were dark and calm, and when he smiled, it wasn't hunger that showed, it was ownership. Behind him, in the lane, the darkness held the suggestion of a horse, presence without clear form, like an outline cut from night. The rider's gaze slid past him into the house, toward the kitchen, toward the chalice. He stepped forward, and the porch boards did not creak beneath him. "I have arrived," he said softly, as if announcing a scheduled visit. And as he crossed the threshold, the windless night followed him in. Chapter 5. A bargain no one remembers. Valerius stepped into the hallway as though the house had been built to fit his stride. He did not glance around like a stranger. He did not pause to learn the layout. His eyes moved with the slow certainty of someone revisiting a place he had once claimed and never truly left. The cloak around his shoulders was too dark to be cloth in any ordinary sense, more like a piece of night cut cleanly and draped in human shape. "You've grown," he said softly, and the words settled in the air like dust. The sentence made no sense. They had never met. And yet the tone suggested an old relationship, the familiarity of a man greeting a nephew he hadn't seen in years. "You're wrong," he said. Your voice came out smaller than you intended. "I don't know you." Valerius smiled the way someone smiles at a child insisting the moon isn't real. "Not with your mind," he replied, "but your blood knows its history. Blood never forgets the hand that taught it to kneel." He walked past you without touching, yet the hairs on your arms rose as if brushed by cold fingers. He moved toward the kitchen, and the house seemed to widen for him, corridors subtly shifting in the way shadows shift when someone lights a candle. You followed because fear had become a leash, and because a part of you, the too steady part, wanted answers, the way hunger wants food. In the kitchen, Valerius stopped beside the table, looking at the chalice with something like fondness. "My cup," he murmured. Not triumphant, not greedy. Simply possessive, as if naming a familiar object returned to its rightful shelf. Then he looked at you again and spoke the sentence that chilled your bones more than any threat. "It took you long enough to come home." You tried to anchor yourself in logic. "My grandmother, she didn't." Valerius lifted a hand slightly, and the motion was so controlled it felt ceremonial. "Your grandmother," he said, "was a woman of remarkable discipline. She lived with a cup under her feet and did not taste it. That is why she died as humans die." The words made death sound like a category, a habit, something you could choose to participate in or not. "And you," he continued, voice gentle, "you came back the moment the house was empty enough to speak to you, the moment the old will stop pressing its thumb to the bargain." "I didn't agree to anything," he whispered again, as if repetition might turn it true. Valerius's gaze softened. It was almost pity. "A debt does not require agreement from the heir," he said. "Only inheritance." He reached into his cloak and withdrew something small and dull, an old coin, blackened by time. He placed it on the table beside the chalice. It did not clink. It landed with a sound like a drop of water falling into a deep well. "This is how it begins," he said. "One pays, one receives. The receiver forgets it was payment at all." You stared at the coin. On its surface was the same crest, chalice and thorns, and the crossed-out eye that had haunted your great-grandfather's journal. Valerius watched you with quiet patience. "You are the heir to a debt," he repeated. "And debts don't die with the debtor. They simply change hands." The sentence felt like a collar snapping closed. Valerius moved one finger along the rim of the chalice without touching the liquid. The ruby surface rippled anyway, responding like a loyal animal. He didn't even look down. "Villages like this survive on stories," he said, conversationally. "They call it a curse because curses are easier than accounting." You forced yourself to ask the question that had grown teeth in your mind. "What is it then?" "A deposit," he said. "A way for a starving thing to ensure its hunger has structure." He glanced at you. "The cup was left here long ago. Not for you, not for your grandmother, for the line, for the land, for summer." He tapped the table once, and the sound seemed to travel through the floorboards like a pulse. "Every year it fills itself because it remembers, and if someone drinks, the deposit begins to earn interest." You tried to keep your voice steady. "Interest." Valerius nodded, as if discussing money rather than bodies. "Strength, endurance, a heart that beats like a clock, wounds that close with indecent speed, fear that becomes manageable." His eyes stayed on you. "All of it is borrowed." "From whom?" His smile returned, smaller. "From the future you would have had." The words slipped into you like cold water. You imagined years being shaved off invisibly, poured into a cup, measured and stored. You imagined your own life reduced to a number on a ledger. Valerius's voice lowered, intimate. "No gift is free. The chalice gives you what you crave most, then charges you in the only currency you cannot hide." He leaned slightly closer. "Time." The kitchen lamp flickered once, and for a moment your shadow on the wall looked too long, too thin. Valerius spoke softly, as though revealing a secret meant for a single ear. "You think the ruby liquid is blood," he said. "It smells like it." "Smell is a language," he replied, "and you have begun to understand it." His eyes narrowed with faint approval. "But what it truly is permission." You swallowed. Your throat felt dry and metallic. "Permission for what?" Valerius lifted the copper seal from where you'd placed it earlier, turning it in his pale fingers like a coin. "This," he said, "is a lock. The chalice is a vessel. The ruby is a key." He set the seal down. The metal seemed to darken under his touch. "Long ago," he continued, "I learned a truth humans avoid because it makes them small. A body is not owned by the mind, it is rented by it, and renters can be replaced." Your stomach turned. Valerius's voice remained calm. "The ruby liquid does not simply strengthen the drinker, it makes them hospitable." He smiled faintly. "It opens rooms inside you that have been closed since birth." You backed away instinctively, bumping the counter. "No." "No," he echoed, and the word sounded amused. "You have been saying that. It is admirable. But you are saying it to a process, not a person." He tilted his head, listening, and you realized with sick clarity that he wasn't listening to your breathing. He was listening to your heartbeat. "Your body is already learning how to welcome," he murmured. That night you discovered what it meant when he said, "hospitable." It began with small things. Your hands stopped trembling when you tried to hold a knife. Your fear sharpened into cold focus. Your senses felt too clean. Sounds too clear, shadows too detailed, smells too loud. Then the thoughts began to arrive that were not yours. Not voices exactly. Not hallucinations, suggestions. When you looked at the chalice, you felt a calm certainty that it belonged in your hands. When you looked away, you felt an itch in your bones, a quiet discomfort, like forgetting to lock the door. You clenched your jaw and tried to remember your grandmother's face, her stubborn mouth, her tapping knuckles. You told yourself you were not weak. You told yourself you were still choosing. Valerius watched you the way one watches a candle flame bend toward air currents. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "I feel nothing," you lied. He laughed softly. "You feel more than ever. That is the trap. Strength makes you trust your own control. And that is when control is easiest to remove." He stepped closer, and the air around him cooled. Your skin prickled. Your heart kept its perfect rhythm, betraying you with its calm. Valerius raised one finger and hovered it near your forehead without touching. "Free will," he said, "is not stolen. It is softened, melted, like wax warmed until it no longer remembers it was once hard." You tried to step back. Your feet did not move for a heartbeat too long, and in that pause you felt terror bloom. pure and bright, because you understood. Your body had begun to hesitate before obeying you. The next morning, you tried to leave the village. You didn't pack. You didn't announce it. You simply walked down the lane to your car with the desperate calm of someone escaping a burning room. The air outside was still windless. The sun was bright and cruel. The road seemed normal. You started the engine. It purred with unnecessary smoothness. Your hands were steady on the wheel. Your heart beat perfectly. You drove. For 5 minutes, 10, 15. Trees slid past, the road curved. You watched the distance carefully, counting landmarks, checking the way the sun sat on the left side of the windshield. Then you saw the village sign. Valerius. You slammed the brakes. Gravel spat. The car stopped in a dust cloud, and there it was again, the same cracked paint, the same added board beneath it. Do not drink. Your mouth went dry. You turned the car around and drove in the opposite direction, faster this time, breath tight. The trees blurred. The road straightened. And after 15 minutes, you saw the sign again. Not a different sign, the same one. The board beneath it looked freshly carved, the letters too sharp. This time, a new line had been added beneath, "Do not drink," as if the village, or something within it, had decided to speak directly to you. You already did. You sat in the car, hands locked on the wheel, feeling the heat press against the windows like a living thing. The village wasn't surrounded by a wall. It didn't need one. Every road led back because the trap was not made of geography. It was made of agreement you didn't remember making. When you returned to the house, Valerius was in the kitchen as if he had never left it. He stood by the table, hands folded behind his back, looking out the window at the motionless apple trees. He didn't turn when you entered. "I told you," he said gently. "Every road leads back." You didn't answer. You couldn't trust your voice. Valerius spoke again, still facing the window. "Tell me," he said, "when you cut your finger, did you enjoy the smell?" Your stomach twisted. Your mouth watered against your will. Valerius's voice lowered, velvet soft. "That is how it works," he murmured. "Thirst is not an emotion, it is an instruction." He finally turned to look at you. His eyes held no rush, no anger, only certainty. "Listen," he said, and the single word struck something deep in you, like a finger pressing a bruise. You heard it then, your own pulse, loud, warm, impatient. You smelled the iron in the air, sharper than ever. Your tongue felt too big in your mouth. Saliva gathered as though preparing for a taste you hadn't chosen. Valerius smiled, pleased. "There," he whispered. "I didn't touch you. I didn't move the chalice. I only reminded your body what it wants." You gripped the edge of the counter until your knuckles whitened. "Stop." "I can," he said softly, "but why would I? Thirst is the most honest prayer." And in that moment, you understood what made him terrifying. Not teeth, not speed, not strength, control. The ability to command your hungers with words. That night, while Valerius was elsewhere in the house, or perhaps nowhere at all, you tried to destroy the chalice. You dragged it to the sink and struck it with a hammer. The blow rang through the kitchen like a bell. The chalice didn't dent. You struck again, harder, anger rising, fear turning to violence because violence felt simpler than bargaining. The chalice remained perfect. Not a scratch, not a mark. The hammer, however, chipped. Metal dust fell, not from the chalice, but from your tool. You stared, breath shaking, and felt a cold laugh crawl up your spine, as if the house itself found this attempt charming. You tried the knife. You scraped the rim until the blade squealed. The blade dulled. The chalice gleamed in the lamplight as if enjoying the attention. In desperation, you lifted it and tried to throw it out the window. Your arms locked, not in pain, in refusal. You stood there holding it, muscles tense, and realized with slow horror that your body would not permit the chalice to leave your hands. Not because Valerius stopped you, because something in you had already accepted the chalice as necessary. You forced your fingers open with the other hand, prying them like a child's stubborn grip. When the chalice finally dropped to the table, it landed without sound. The ruby liquid inside did not spill. It didn't even ripple. It simply sat, calm, as if it knew it could not be harmed by effort. As if it knew your strength was already part of the payment. You returned to the journal with shaking hands because the journal was the last voice in the house that did not belong to Valerius. Pages blurred as you flipped, searching for anything that wasn't warning, anything that was instruction. You found it near the back, written in a different ink, as if added later by someone desperate. A rite, a procedure. Not for destroying the chalice, but for interrupting it. The handwriting was frantic. Seal the ruby in the earth. Not in stone, not in wood, not in water. Earth remembers weight. Earth holds contracts. There were steps listed in broken sentences. Salt in a circle. Iron at 4 points like compass directions. The crest pressed into soil. Blood, willing blood on the seal. And one final line underlined so hard the paper tore. Do not let him speak your full name. You read it again and again. A ritual meant to anchor the ruby, anchor the permission back into ground where it could be contained. Not a victory, a delay. But delay was a kind of survival. You looked at the copper seal on the table and realized why it had been hidden beneath the boards. It wasn't a keepsake. It was a tool, a lock. And perhaps, if you were careful, a weapon made of words and soil instead of muscle. Valerius returned when the house had gone fully dark. He stood in the kitchen doorway watching you with the journal open before you, the copper seal beside it, salt and iron gathered like pathetic offerings. He did not look angry, he looked amused. Ugh, he said softly. You found the old instructions? You didn't answer. Your throat was tight because you understood the last underlined warning with sudden urgency. Names were doors. Names were consent shaped into sound. Valerius walked closer, stopping on the other side of the table. The chalice sat between you like a third party in the conversation. You want to seal it, he said gently. You want to return it to the earth and pretend you can outweight me. I want my life back, you whispered. Valerius's eyes softened in a way that felt wrong, like a blade wrapped in velvet. Your life, he said, was always collateral. You simply didn't know. He leaned forward slightly. The air cooled. The kitchen shadows seemed to tighten around him. There is a kindness in what I offer, he continued. You can hand the chalice back and pay what your line owes. I will take what was deposited, with interest, and you will be finished. Quietly. The word finished landed like a closing lid. Or, he said, and his smile sharpened, you can keep it. Your stomach clenched. Keep it. Become what your grandmother refused to be, Valerius whispered. A keeper, a caretaker, the village's summer guardian. His voice was almost tender. You will not die as humans die. You will be strong. You will be calm. You will be necessary. You stared at him, heartbeat perfect, mouth dry, mind screaming. And the price, you forced out. Valerius's gaze dropped to your throat, listening to the warmth inside you. The price, he said, is that one day you will hear a knock in your walls that sounds like swallowing, and you will understand it as hunger. And you will open the door not because I force you. His eyes lifted to meet yours, dark and patient. But because you will want to. He straightened and placed one pale hand beside the chalice without touching it. The ruby liquid rose a fraction, as if greeting him. Choose, Valerius said softly. Hand it back, or become its new keeper. And in the windless heat of the kitchen, with the house breathing around you, you realized the most terrifying part of the bargain. Either choice would change you into something you might never be able to name again. Chapter 6. When ruby liquid stops being liquid, the choice did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a sensation, an internal shift, quiet and irreversible, like a bone setting itself wrong. You stood on one side of the table, Valerius on the other, and the chalice between you behaved as if it were the true host of the room. Then it began to breathe. Not metaphorically, not as a poetic feeling. The ruby liquid rose and fell in a slow rhythm, lifting in a dome above the rim, then sinking back as if exhaling. Each rise came with a faint sound, soft and wet like the inside of a mouth. Each fall came with a small click from the metal like a heartbeat answering. Inhale. The liquid swelled. Exhale. It settled, but never as low as before, as if each breath kept a fraction for itself. The air in the kitchen changed with the rhythm. When the chalice inhaled, the room cooled sharply and your skin tightened. When it exhaled, the heat returned. Thick, sweet, pressing. The house synchronized with it. The wood in the walls creaked in the same cadence, like ribs expanding and contracting. Valerius watched with something like respect. "You feel it," he said, almost reverent. "The chalice is no longer content to sit." You swallowed. The movement sounded too loud. Your throat tasted of iron without any blood on your tongue. "What is it doing?" you asked, though you already felt the answer gathering behind your teeth. Valerius's gaze slid from the chalice to you. "Preparing," he said softly. "When the ruby stops behaving like liquid, it becomes what it truly is." "And what is that?" He smiled, small and patient. "A passage." The chalice inhaled again, and for a heartbeat you felt your own lungs hesitate, as if forgetting the habit of breathing. The first face appeared at midnight. You had moved the chalice into the living room, away from the kitchen table as if distance could reduce its authority. You kept the lamp on low and sat on the floor with the journal open, salt and iron gathered beside you, the copper seal cold in your palm. The chalice sat on the rug, breathing. Inhale, exhale. You stared at the ruby surface until your eyes burned, forcing yourself to observe rather than obey. That was your only weapon now, attention, refusal to look away. Then the surface changed, not with ripples, with depth. The ruby darkened into something like glass, and beneath it the liquid became clear enough to show shapes moving within, slow, distorted outlines like bodies suspended in water. A face rose near the surface as if drawn upward by curiosity. It was pale, thin, eyes closed. You recognized it with a sick lurch, Mrs. Dinah's dog. Not the whole animal, only the face, frozen in a final howl that had never finished. You jerked back, breath sharp. The face sank. Another rose in its place. A man now, older, cheeks hollow, mouth slightly open, as if still trying to speak. His eyes fluttered behind his lids. You had seen him in the village once, sitting on the shop steps, staring at nothing. You realized with sudden clarity that he hadn't been staring. He had been remembering. The face in the chalice opened its eyes. They were cloudy, unfocused, yet they turned directly toward you as if the ruby liquid were a window and you stood on the other side. Your stomach twisted. You whispered, "Who are you?" The face's lips moved without sound. Then the ruby surface trembled and a whisper rose. Not Valerius's voice, not yours, but a chorus of thin breaths threaded together. "We are the interest." You stared, paralyzed, as more faces drifted beneath the surface. Young, old, familiar, unfamiliar. Each one pale, each one suspended, each one watching without truly seeing. The chalice didn't just fill. It collected. Valerius spoke as if explaining weather. "The village tells it wrong," he said, pacing slowly with hands behind his back. "They say the cup fills every summer. They say it calls the owner." He stopped beside the chalice and looked down into the ruby depths as though into a beloved well. "But the cup does not call me," he continued. "It merely records that someone has touched the bargain." Your voice came out raw. "Then why does it fill?" Valerius glanced at you, eyes calm. "Because the world has seasons," he said, "and hunger has tides." You forced yourself to ask the worst question. "What is the rule?" Valerius's smile was almost tender. "I come whenever someone drinks," he said simply. "Not always immediately, not always in the same form, but the moment the ruby passes the threshold of the mouth, the invitation becomes complete." "I didn't drink," you said again, clinging to it. Valerius's gaze softened with cruel patience. "You tasted," he corrected. "You listened. You bled. Your body healed in exchange. That is drinking in a different language." He leaned closer, voice low. "Do you know why your grandmother lived so long?" he asked. "Because she never let the ruby cross her lips. She let the cup fill and fill and fill, but she refused the final permission." You swallowed, throat tight. Valerius's eyes flicked toward your mouth. "And you," he murmured, "have already begun to feel how easy it would be to stop resisting. How good it would be to be strong without struggle." Your jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Valerius lifted his head slightly, as if scenting the air. "I want what is mine," he said. "And you can give it to me in one of two ways." He did not say the ways. He didn't need to. The chalice inhaled, and the ruby rose like a swelling lung, as if eager to hear your answer. Morning arrived, and it was wrong. Sunlight poured through the curtains in clean gold, but it carried no comfort. It fell on your hands like light from a distant star, bright, indifferent, cold in the mind. You stepped outside to prove something to yourself. The village road shimmered with heat. Birds finally sang again, tentative, as if testing whether it was safe. Someone opened a window across the street, and for a moment ordinary life tried to return, but your body did not accept it. The sunlight on your skin felt thin, as if it could not reach deep enough to warm you. You stood in it and waited for the familiar pleasant ache of heat, for the easing of tension. Nothing. Instead, you felt the opposite, a faint irritation, like too much noise. Your eyes narrowed, and you realized the brightness made you want to turn away, not in pain, but in preference. Shade looked better. Shadow looked kind. Your senses were sharper now. You heard the soft scrape of a shovel 2 houses away. You smelled the damp of earth beneath the road. You tasted iron even in the air, like the world had been built on metal, and you had only just learned the flavor of it. Your body felt strong. Not muscular, not athletic, strong in the way a wire is strong. Taut, steady, ready. Your fear no longer rose as panic. It rose as a cold awareness of options. And in that cold awareness, you understood the true danger of the chalice's gift. It didn't simply change the world. It changed what you considered comfortable. The sun hadn't become cold. You had. That evening, you began the rite. You didn't do it because you believed in magic. You did it because you had run out of explanations that could save you. And because the journal, written by hands that had trembled with the same fear, offered you one thing your mind craved: structure. You gathered what the pages demanded. Salt, coarse, white, enough to draw a circle that didn't break. Iron, 4 heavy nails from the tool shed, dark and blunt. The copper seal, cold, engraved with chalice and thorns, the crossed-out eye like a warning carved into metal. And blood, willing blood. That last requirement made your stomach twist. Willing. Consent again. Everything came back to consent. You carried the supplies to the kitchen hall and stood before the basement door. The air there was colder than the rest of the house. The ruby stain on the floor glistened, spreading in thin branching lines that looked disturbingly like veins. You drew a circle of salt around the doorframe, careful, unbroken. You hammered the iron nails into the floor at 4 points, north, south, east, west, until the metal bit into wood with a dull, final sound. Then you placed the copper seal in the center of the circle. It looked small and helpless against the enormity of what you were trying to contain. Your hands shook as you produced the knife. A shallow cut, just enough. You pressed the blade to your palm and pushed. Pain flashed. Blood welled. Dark, thick, smelling immediately of iron, so strong it made your mouth water and your stomach turn. You held your bleeding palm over the seal. Willing, you whispered, forcing the word through clenched teeth. Willing to end this. Blood dripped onto the copper crest. It hissed softly, not from heat, but from reaction, as if the seal had been thirsty too. The air in the hallway tightened. The basement door creaked. And from the living room, where you had left the chalice, came a sound like a slow inhale. Valerius did not rush to stop you. That was the most horrifying thing. His patience. You heard his footsteps behind you. Not hurried, not angry, simply arriving. When you turned, he stood at the end of the hall, half lit by a single lamp, cloak folding into the shadows around him. He looked pleased. "You're doing it correctly," he said softly. You held up your bleeding hand like a warning. "Don't come closer." Valerius tilted his head, listening to your heartbeat as if it were music. "I don't have to come closer," he replied. "Your house is already inside you." You felt cold creep across your skin, as if his words carried temperature. He stepped forward anyway, and the light around him seemed to dim, not because the lamp changed, but because the shadows thickened near him, stretching like ink in water. It wasn't that he moved through darkness. Darkness moved with him. He entered the hallway the way shadow enters light, silently, inevitably, without breaking the rules of the world, because he was part of the rules. Your salt circle did not stop him. He didn't cross it. He didn't need to. He stood just outside it, smiling. "You think the earth will hold the ruby," he said, gentle. "It might. For a while. He glanced at the basement door, then at you. "But you misunderstand one thing," he added. "The greatest seal is not salt or iron. The greatest seal is the mind that refuses to open." His eyes sharpened. "And your mind is tired." The chalice, somewhere behind him, made a soft sound, like liquid shifting in a cup. You realized the ritual alone wouldn't be enough. Valerius had seen it before. He expected it. That meant it was not a weapon, it was a delay. A bandage on a wound that wanted to be reopened. So you did something desperate. Something intelligent and terrible. You left the salt circle unbroken and moved toward the living room where the chalice sat, breathing. Valerius followed without haste, like a teacher watching a student approach the correct answer. The chalice's ruby surface was high, trembling near the rim. Beneath it, faces drifted like pale fish in a red sea. You lifted the knife again. Valerius's smile widened a fraction. "Yes," he murmured. "That's it. Give your body what it wants." You shook your head, eyes locked on the chalice. "No," he whispered. "I'm giving it what you want." You cut deeper this time. Blood flowed into your palm, warm, immediate, thick. The smell hit you like a punch. Your mouth watered so hard it hurt. Your body begged you to lick it. Your muscles tensed with instinct. You didn't. Instead, you let the blood drip. Not into your mouth, not into the chalice. Onto the floor. A thin trail leading away from the living room and back toward the salt circle in the hallway. A bait line. Valerius watched, eyes dark with approval and curiosity. "Clever," he whispered, "but you still bleed for me." You kept dripping blood, step by step, until you reached the copper seal. You knelt and let your blood fall onto the crest again, saturating it, feeding it. The seal darkened, the air cooled, and you felt something shift, the faintest resistance in the house, like earth tightening its grip. Valerius stepped closer, finally showing the first hint of hunger, not in his mouth stayed calm. But in his stillness, in the way he stopped moving as if afraid to miss what came next. You had broken the chalice's rule. You had offered blood without drinking. You had made the ruby smell the door without giving it the key of your mouth. You remembered the inscription, the letters that refused daylight. You had never been able to fully read them upstairs. But down here, near the basement door, where the cold did not belong, the letters in your mind sharpened, as if the house itself wanted them spoken. You pulled the chalice close enough to see its rim and held your bleeding palm above the seal. Valerius's voice was quiet now, attentive. "You cannot outmuscle an agreement," he said. "I know," you answered, throat tight. "That's why I'm not fighting you with muscle." You leaned in and spoke the words you had traced before, the ones that had revealed themselves only under night and fear. They came out like something memorized by blood rather than mind. Not a gift, a claim. Not a claim without witness, not a witness without consent. Valerius's expression changed, subtly, but you saw it. The calm slipped for a heartbeat, replaced by something colder. You continued, forcing the words through the dryness in your throat. "The chalice gives strength. The strength is borrowed. The borrower may return what was taken by sealing the ruby where earth can count it." The air trembled. The chalice's breathing stuttered. Valerius stepped forward sharply, the first sudden movement you'd seen from him. His eyes narrowed. "Stop," he said, voice still soft, but now edged. You raised your bleeding hand higher and spoke the final line you hadn't understood until now, the one your great-grandfather had underlined by tearing paper. "The owner enters only by the mouth. No mouth, no entrance, no claim." The words landed like iron spikes. The chalice shuddered. The ruby liquid rose sharply, then sank, as if choking on its own breath. Valerius's face was perfectly still, yet the shadows around him tightened, a subtle recoil, as if the language itself had teeth. The moment you finished speaking, the house answered, not with a voice, with movement. A deep groan rolled up from beneath the floorboards, a sound like the earth shifting its shoulders. The basement door bulged outward slightly, then settled. The salt circle shimmered faintly as if heat passed through it. The ruby stain on the floor surged, veins widening, crawling toward the seal, then froze abruptly, as if held in place by an unseen hand. The chalice's breathing became frantic. Inhale, inhale, inhale. The ruby liquid rose to the brim and trembled there, vibrating like a held scream. You slammed the chalice down onto the copper seal. Metal met metal with a sound like a bell muffled by flesh. Your blood on the seal sizzled faintly. The crest darkened further, as if drinking. Then the floor cracked. A thin fracture ran across the hallway boards, splitting the wood like a lightning vein. Cold air burst up from the crack, carrying a smell of stone and iron so strong it made your eyes water. Valerius stepped back, cloak snapping slightly as if caught by a breeze that didn't exist. The crack widened. The basement door shuddered. And then, with a sound like a giant exhale, the floor beneath the basement door gave way. Boards splintered inward. Stone collapsed. Dust rose in a choking cloud. You grabbed the hallway wall, fighting for balance, as the earth beneath the house sank, slowly, deliberately, like something being buried alive. The chalice slid a fraction, then stopped, as if anchored. Valerius did not fall. He did not stumble. He simply watched, eyes dark, face unreadable. When the dust settled, the basement door was gone, replaced by a jagged hole filled with darkness and broken stone. The cold rising from it was immense, a winter breath from deep underground. You coughed, eyes burning, and looked around. The house still stood, but it felt different. Not relieved. Not safe. Alive in a quieter, deeper way, like a sleeping animal whose breathing you could still hear if you pressed your ear to the floor. They found you at dawn. Not the police. Not a rescue team. Mrs. Dinah, standing on your porch as if she had always known where you would end up. Her eyes were pale and tired, and behind her stood two villagers you didn't recognize, faces blank as closed doors. You sat on the floor of the hallway, salt smeared on your knees, blood dried on your palm. The air in the house was cooler now, as if the heat had been drained. Mrs. Dinah looked past you into the broken floor where the basement had collapsed. She nodded once, slow. "You sealed it," she whispered, not with gratitude, but with resignation. You tried to speak, but your throat only produced a dry sound. Mrs. Dinah stepped closer, crouched, and took your injured hand in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "It's never forever," she murmured. "It's only later." You looked at her, confusion and fear mixing, and finally forced the question out. "Valerius?" Mrs. Dinah's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, toward the place where the chalice had been. Her voice was barely audible. "He doesn't die," she said. "He changes patience." You followed her gaze. The chalice sat on the kitchen table again. You didn't remember carrying it there. It gleamed darkly in the morning light, its letters faint and unreadable as if asleep. And inside it, impossibly, ruby liquid sat calm at the bottom, a small pool waiting for summer heat to wake it. Mrs. Dinah stood, shoulders heavy. "Your grandmother held it back," she said. "Now you will too." You swallowed, tasting metal. Outside, the village finally had wind again. Leaves moved, birds sang, life tried to pretend it had never paused. But as the sun rose higher, you felt its warmth remain distant, like warmth meant for other people. And when you glanced at the chalice one last time, you saw something that made your stomach drop. Beneath the ruby surface, a new face drifted. Young, curious, unfamiliar. A stranger. Someone you had not seen in Velen. Someone who next summer might return to the village for paperwork and a sale. Someone who would smell iron for no reason at all. And somewhere deep under the house, far below broken stone and sealed earth, the darkness exhaled, slow, patient, breathing not stopped, only buried, waiting to be tasted again.